Good morning, Mesa. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Landon Ubrig, and I grew up attending here at Mesa pretty much my whole life. And a year after high school, I left for Lubbock, Texas, where I did a missions program called AIM. And I served up in Wasilla, Alaska for nearly 2 years, and then returning, graduated the program. I went to Sunset International Bible Institute, where I've been the last 3 years, and just graduated from in May. And so I've started this internship with AIM in May as part of their full-time staff doing recruiting. And so that's a little bit about me, and that's where I've been. But I'm really glad to be able to be here with you to worship God and to talk to you about His Word. It's really good to be back here in Arizona. I have a lot of fond memories growing up here and spending time here at Mesa, but just this state in general. As a kid growing up, I thought I would never leave. I just wanted to stay here. I had so many good memories, so many friends, and I'm sure that you also have a lot of fond memories. As you look to your past and look at your childhood, you might have a lot of things that you remember and think of well. Something that you might think of in your childhood or in your past might be something called Blockbuster. I don't know if you've heard of it. And for some of us, I personally just barely remember it. But for some of us, that was movie nights, family nights, maybe with the youth group or the young adults, walking those aisles, looking for a movie, and finally picking one and going back home. Now, of course, Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore. They refused to adapt to what the world was changing to, us wanting more convenience. And a little company called Netflix started to mail out DVDs and movies to your home, and you didn't have to go to the store anymore. You were able to just watch it and order it from your home. And then eventually they started streaming. And so Netflix created a new standard, and one that Blockbuster did not follow, one that they refused to change, and that mistake for them cost them everything. And that's the thing about mistakes. So our choices have consequences. Our choices cost us something, especially our mistakes. They cost something. Something small. Sometimes it's small, like late fees at Blockbuster, or maybe it's something bigger, though. Something that cost enormous. Sin is one of those mistakes that we don't fully realize how costly it can be, and that it's far greater than we may ever actually be able to pay. This morning, we're going to be exploring this theme that Jeremy has started for us, under construction. This morning, we're taking a closer look, trying to understand atonement. This morning, we'll explore atonement to understand the cost of sin and to really understand how fully Christ has paid that debt for us. And so we can draw near to God with confidence and invite others into that same hope that we're able to anchor ourselves into. And so again, we're going to be continuing this series that Jeremy started for us, and we're looking at atonement and propitiation. And like it says up there, we're going to start off in Exodus 40, if you'll begin to turn there with me. Exodus 40. To begin, before we define atonement, I'm wanting to look at this story here in Exodus, starting here. Looking at Moses. Moses was this great leader of Israel. He led them out of captivity in Egypt, and he had this close personal relationship with God. In Deuteronomy, it actually describes him as having a face-to-face relationship with God. It wasn't just kind of close, but he was extremely close and personal with God. But despite this close relationship he has, despite being this great prophet for the nation of Israel, there is a time when he is disconnected with God, when he is unable to be before God. This is right after God has given instructions for how to build his tabernacle, how to set up this place of worship for him. And they finish that, and that's where we'll be starting off in Exodus. Exodus 40, 34 to 35, it says this. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses is unable to come before God right now. He can come up to the door of the temple, the tent of meeting, but he's not able to be in there anymore like he used to. He no longer is able to just be in God's presence like he has before. And so what's the issue? Why is this the case? Well, as it says here in this passage, we can see that God's glory has filled the temple. God in the past has not had a permanent tabernacle built. The tabernacle wasn't to the standard that he wanted, and it's finally built as he wants it to his specifications, and it's completed in a more permanent structure, and God's able to now fully dwell in there. And so we are not able to just be in the full presence of God. And the reason for that is because God is so holy. And God's holiness cannot be in the presence of sin. Or rather, sin can't be in the presence of God's holiness. And the Israelites in their wandering in the desert, they were trying their best, but really we know how that story goes. They get the 10 Commandments, and even immediately after receiving God's law and his instructions for them, they're already breaking covenant with God. They're already sinning and ruining that relationship with him, and they don't fully understand the cost of their sin and that it is separating them from him. Their sin has created a barrier with God. Now, I don't know if you have ever locked your keys inside of your house and maybe locked yourself out or maybe locked your keys in your car, but when I was in Alaska, there was a night that we were just spending time with the young adults. It was a Wednesday night, and after church, we went out and we were going to go to Cold Stone. And I get out of my car that I had up there, and I'm feeling my pockets. I had locked the door, and I'm double checking that I have my keys, and I realize that I don't. And so I get real close to the window. I'm up against the car. I'm trying to see if I can get any of the doors open. Maybe they didn't fully lock. They all did. They were really well locked. And I'm looking in through the window, and I can see my keys still in the truck. And so I go and I talk to my teammates, and I need them to take me back to my apartment. Luckily, I have a spare key that's in my apartment. It's great. But the thing was that my roommate, was out of town. So the other key was not in the state, so I couldn't get into my apartment either. I went home and was hoping that the front door would still be unlocked, and the same process. No matter how close I got to that front door, I was still locked out. I was still separated from the inside of my apartment. Now, luckily, we had kind of thought about this. We were on the second floor, and so we left one of our windows unlocked on purpose. And so I was able to climb up onto our balcony and push our window open, and we eventually got back into my car. But I hope that this kind of paints a picture for you what it looks like to be separated. Because no matter how close I was to the door of my car, the door to my apartment, I was separated from the inside. I was not fully there. I was not going to be able to get back into there unless the problem was removed. In Israel, no matter how close they got to that tent of meeting, no matter how close, maybe right up against the fabric of that tent or the entranceway of that tent, they would not be able to be inside. And the reason was because their sin had locked them on the other side, separated them from God. And so one of the costs of sin is not only just death, the cost of sin being death, but it's separation from God. Separation from a holy creator who loves us. And we hear this with God's spokesman, with Moses, who had this close relationship. Even he was unable to have this, or to be in God's presence with sin. No matter how close he was with God, he was unable to be in his presence. But it's not just Moses. It's not just Moses that we see this with, but actually in Leviticus later, when God starts to go through the sacrificial system, we'll see that even Aaron, the priest, the high priest, the man who's supposed to represent Israel before God and take and intercede for them, even Aaron cannot just come into God's presence whenever he desires, whenever he wants to. Leviticus 16, verse 2, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron your brother not to come into the not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil, before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. And so God is giving the Israelites, he's giving Moses and Aaron instructions for different sacrifices to make themselves right with God. And even in that, even in trying to make themselves right, they can't just approach God for this process. There's steps. Aaron cannot come at any time that he chooses. He has to do this in the correct order that God is going to tell them. And so even Aaron is locked out from God's presence. And these two men representing Israel, being spiritual leaders, it shows the state that the whole of Israel is in, really. It shows that all of Israel was separated from God. Not just these two men, but all of Israel had a relationship that had been severed with God, that had been disrupted. And it's because God's holiness cannot dwell with sin. I think there's an important thing we can learn from looking at our phones. So you might have a phone screen like mine with some cracks on it, but maybe you really like having a pristine screen, really clean and free from any blemishes. But as soon as you drop it and you get even the smallest crack on it, even if it doesn't bother you, it's in the corner, real small, you can't even notice it, your screen is still cracked. And the truth is if you were to try and resell it, they're going to look at it and they're going to label it as a cracked screen, even if it's small and doesn't really bother you, because they want it to be perfect. And the same is true with God and sin in our lives. Is no matter what the sin is, if we feel like it's small and insignificant, it still labels the whole. We're still sinful and lawbreakers. We've still, even the smallest, maybe what we see as small, is separating us from God. And so the question becomes, how can sinful people survive in God's presence? How can we survive in the presence of a holy God? And that's where atonement comes in. That's what I want us to look at this morning, is to understand this word here in the Hebrew that we translate as atonement. The Hebrew word means to cover or to wipe away, to atone. And it's mostly used in the Old Testament in that sense, to cover over. Now we'll see it specifically in the story of Noah when he's building the ark. God gives him the instructions to build the ark, and he says to cover it with pitch, and that's that word atonement. To cover over. And if we remember that story, God sends a flood to the earth as judgment for the sin that had built up. And so what did that pitch do? The pitch protected the ark from the judgment. It kept those judgment waters from coming into the ark and removed the judgment for those inside. And so it's the act of dealing with sin so that we can restore a relationship with him. So it's covering over our sins, wiping them away, removing the issue that separates us from God. It restores our relationship with him so that we are not needing to receive the judgment that's due for our sin. And so atonement comes from God as a way to bridge this gap. He's offering it to us. He is giving us a way to pay and make atonement with him because he loves us and desires this relationship with his creation. But a relationship with a holy God can't be restored without addressing that sin problem. I want to look at how God gives atonement to us. In Hebrews 9, the writer talks about how under the law, there was no forgiveness, there was nothing could be purified without blood. And without blood, that there was no forgiveness of sins. God is just, and for evil there are consequences, and he upholds the consequences for that. He executes judgment when there's sin brought, or when we commit sins. And the judgment that's due for sin is death. And so the payment that has to be made for us to remove our sin, to remove that judgment that's due for us, is there has to be life paid. And that's where the blood and where these sacrifices come into play. The life of the offender is required. But again, God doesn't just leave people in a place where they're stuck. He gives us a way to make atonement. He gave the Israelites a way to make atonement. He gives them animal sacrifices, this way to substitute themselves instead of them having to pay the cost of death and their blood being used to pay for their sin. They're instead able to use an animal. In Leviticus 16, we're going to be continuing to look at the Day of Atonement. This, I think, really wraps up what atonement is and gives us the clearest picture of how God offers us atonement through these sacrifices. And this day, it consisted of several different sacrifices. It wasn't just one special one that was good for the whole year, but it was several sacrifices leading up to one main event, you could say. The specific sacrifice involved 2 goats. And the high priest would cast lots over them, and he would randomly decide which one. And one would be dedicated to God, and the other is said that it was dedicated to Azazel, the wilderness. One was sacrificed, and the other symbolically carried the sins of the camp of Israel off into the wilderness and not to return. And so we're going to read a little bit of that. Leviticus 16, 20 to 22. It says, "And when he made an end of atoning for the holy place, and the tent of meeting, and the altar, he shall present the live goat." So you kind of see those first little steps, those things he has to do before he's even able to start the actual sacrifice for the day. He has to clean and purify and make atonement for all of these different things, all of these other sacrifices first. And continuing in 21, "And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all their transgressions, all their sins, and he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself into a remote area, and he shall let the goat free into the wilderness." And so the main focus of the Day of Atonement is this sacrifice. There's 2 goats. One's sacrificed, and again, the other symbolically carries off their sin into the wilderness. And both of these goats together represent what atonement does for us. It shows the death that's required. The goats that's sacrificed, the death required of our sin, but the other goat showing the removal of our guilt. That it takes it away and it doesn't return. And that we're free from it. The Day of Atonement was, again, just not this one sacrifice that we just kind of held as more important than the others, but it was a day full of sacrifices. And everything had to be done right in order for there to be atonement made for the whole camp. But it would give atonement. It would cover the sins. It would bring them back into relationship with God. I want to look at another, continuing down in verse 33 and 34. It says, "He shall make atonement for the holy sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting and for the altar, and he shall make atonement for the priests and for the people of the assembly, and this shall be a statute forever for you, that atonement may be made for the people of Israel once in the year because of all their sins. And Aaron did as the Lord commanded Moses." And so this sacrifice, this day, it did bring them back into relationship with God. It did remove all of their sins. It kept them in this right standing with God. But something else I want us to see is that sin stains everything. It affects and pollutes our whole life. It wasn't just for themselves that they're offering atonement for, but they're having to clean these different places where they're bringing sin into. They're having to clean and offer sacrifices to make other things pure. And what I want us to see is that sin it pollutes. It corrupts everything. This sacrifice wasn't just once, though. It needed to be repeated year after year. So it forgave their sins, but as soon as they began to start sinning again, they're back into that stance where they're separated from God. And so imagine, year after year, all of the sacrifices having to be made, even just for this one day, several animals needing to be made for sacrifices, but all of the other sacrifices they've been given. Throughout Leviticus, the whole book talks about all of these different sacrifices for different types of sin, different things they would do. All of the animals having to be sacrificed to keep this relationship with God. And this isn't something that we can just replace with something else, with anything else, but it has to be blood. That has to be this death to pay for sin. Some of you might be really fond of coffee, and you go to a coffee shop, and they have a lot of different options for milk. You can get just regular milk, but you could do 2%, you could do 1%. You could do whole milk, skim milk, half and half. You could even start going into non-dairy products and do soy and almond and hemp and oat milk. And you could do whatever you want, but the thing is, with sacrifices and with gaining atonement and forgiveness with God, it has to be death. There has to be blood to pay the cost. We can't just supplement it with anything that we want. Leviticus 17 emphasizes this for us. Verse 11, it says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life." It's the life there that is needing to be used to pay this cost, to pay this debt that we have with God. And despite the high cost of all of this animal sacrifice, it really did remedy the solution or the situation for them. They did receive atonement. They did get forgiveness. But again, it's needing to be repeated. Though it's not permanent, and though it's just temporary, it did give a solution to their problems for a time. In Numbers 1, verse 1, at the immediate next thing after Leviticus, and after they've done the Day of Atonement and begin implementing these sacrifices, we see a conversation with Moses. Again, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness in Sinai, and that he was in the tent of meeting now. And so Moses is no longer separated from God. We see that after implementing all of these sacrifices, implementing these ways to pay for atonement, that Moses is returned back into the tent with God. Atonement had been made, sin had been covered, and restored their relationship, at least for a time. And so while this was good, it wasn't perfect. These sacrifices were going to have to keep happening year after year. And so that is where Christ comes into play for us. Because all these sacrifices are pointing towards Christ. Everything in the Old Testament is pointing towards Christ. This sacrificial system that's given to Moses and to Aaron is good, but it's not perfect. It's good, but it's only a shadow of what's really coming. It's showing us and pointing us towards Christ, who's going to do this more perfectly and complete for us. God, again, didn't just leave us in a place with this issue of constantly having to offer sacrifices, and instead gave us a way to offer or to have eternal atonement, eternal perfect forgiveness, complete forgiveness. In Romans chapter 3, Brad read this for us earlier, and I think it really does emphasize this really well. Romans 3, 21 to 25. "But now the righteousness of God has been made manifest apart from the law. Although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. All are sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he passed over former sins. So God put forward Christ as a propitiation for us. That's our other word that we're going to be looking at this morning, because they're so similar, atonement and propitiation. What does that mean? Well, atonement is the Hebrew word that we translate as atonement. It means to cover or to wipe away, like we mentioned earlier. But propitiation is the Greek word used for a similar context, a similar understanding. But it comes from a different angle. It comes from this angle of satisfying God's justice so that his wrath is turned away from us. And so there are two different languages that we're getting these two different words from and how we translate them, but they're used very similarly. But propitiation is this idea of wrath being turned away and relationship restored with God. Atonement covers the guilt of our sin, but propitiation carries the idea of relationship being restored because wrath is no longer due for us. It's been satisfied, which is exactly what Christ has done for us at the cross. That's exactly what Christ did when he came and died for us. He paid the full cost of our sin, not just temporarily, but for all time, forgave our sins and wiped them away. And just like those two goats, it shows that his death paid that price, but he also carried our sin away. And that sin, that guilt, does not cling to us, it doesn't stick to us, but it's carried away and it's gone forever. This is the significance of what Christ has really done for us. He's restored that relationship with God for us. He's paid completely the cost of our sin and given us full atonement. Not temporary, not imperfectly, but completely. And that's why when we read passages like Hebrews 6, verse 19 to 20, it says things like this. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone on as a forerunner on our behalf to become high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. We now have a hope that's like an anchor, a hope that's secure, that's steadfast, that's unchanging, because Jesus entered into God's presence as our high priest and offered a perfect sacrifice that we no longer have to worry about the cost of our sin, that we no longer have to worry about how we're going to pay to have a relationship restored with God, because he's done it for us. And we can anchor our hope in Christ. We can be secure in knowing that his love for us is unchanging, that he desires a relationship with us, that he's given us this way to pay for this. And it's not based on anything we've done, but on all completely on what he's done for us. He's offered himself to be that sacrifice to pay the cost for us. So I want to ask us, are you living as someone who's been atoned for? Are you living as someone set free from your sin, free from your guilt? Or are you living as if you are still separated from God? Are you living as if you're still locked out of his presence? Still locked out and looking in? Well, I want you to know that Christ has opened the door for us. He's given us a way in to live with God, to live for God, to be in God's presence. And so this morning, we've seen this dilemma as we've looked at Moses and Aaron and seen how they've been separate from God because of sin and how they were kept out of God's presence, and that it demanded atonement in order to fix it. It demanded life to pay for it. And in Israel's day, that meant sacrifice after sacrifice, costly, expensive, but never permanent. And that was only a shadow of what Christ was going to come and do for us. Christ, the perfect sacrifice, paid our debt once for all. He is our atonement and our propitiation. He paid the cost, and because of him, you don't have to live separate from God anymore. You are no longer locked out of his presence, but you can draw near and have confidence and anchor yourself in the hope that God's given us forever. And so here's our challenge. Don't stand at the door. Don't stand there living as if you're still separated from God, but completely trust and rely and lean on him, because Christ has opened the way for you to have a close, personal relationship with God. And so step into that. Anchor yourself in him this week and boldly share what he's done for you in your life with others. Share that hope that you have and give that hope to somebody who may not have hope. Maybe this morning you realize that you don't have this relationship with Christ yet, that you haven't received atonement, that you haven't been forgiven of your sins. And if that's where you're at, we want to invite you to put Christ on in baptism today, to be cleansed and brought into this relationship with God, to brought into God's presence once and for all. And if we can help you with that this morning, or if there's anything that you need prayers for, we want to invite you to come as we stand and sing.